So we're going to talk about C# today, and we're going to talk about script. So C# is a really awesome language. I've been working with it since the betas. I started doing development with C# back around 2001. It's awesome, but sometimes I'm sad because it feels heavy. And what I mean that it feels heavy, not necessarily that the language feels heavy, but the development experience. And in particular, what I'm talking about is sometimes I just want to play around with C#. I want to try something out. And it takes a lot just to do that. I have to open Visual Studio. I have to create a project. I have to decide what kind of project I'm going to create, and then I have to start writing some code in a class, in a main method, and then I can finally run. And maybe all I want to do is just experiment with an API, some new API that I heard about. Another common task I found myself doing is often doing this little automation. How many people here have built little console apps or Wpf app 1 through 500 or WinForms apps that are all just useful for simple kinds of things? So this is just something that I dealt with for a long time, and there are tools that you can use to just write some C# code outside of Visual Studio. How many people here are familiar with CSC? You can use the CSC compiler. And that's okay as long as you're doing really basic stuff. But as soon as you have to start getting into referencing DLLs and things like that, it's kind of a lot of typing. You have to specify where each DLL is that you want to link in. It's not really designed for you to use it. Visual Studio actually uses it, uses CSC under the covers. So, and then what happened is I started to think to myself, well, could there be this low-cal option of working with C#? Where if all I wanted to, and I see this low-cal option in other kinds of stacks like Ruby, Python, and Node.js. And what I mean by that is if I want to write some Ruby code, I just can use it because it's an interpreted language. I can just open up a text file, write some code, run the Ruby interpreter. Same thing with Python, same thing with Node.js. Anybody here not heard of Node.js? Okay, great. That's awesome. So these languages make it really easy to just kind of get going. And many of them have a REPL, a REPL being reply, eval, print loop, which basically means that I can just run a console and start issuing commands. And many times when I wanted to kind of experiment, this is what I want to do. I want to just try out an API. Maybe I want to make an HTTP call somewhere, but I want to do it in code and play with an object. But I don't really want to have to kind of have the full VS experience. And this was intensified for me when I started to work on bringing Node to Azure, because I basically spent 2 years really immersed in Node.js development. And one of the things that's really salient about Node is you don't need to have an IDE. There's no project, there's no binaries, it's just JavaScript files, and you just get going. And you can start really minimalist. You can start with a couple of lines of code. You don't have to have any kind of class structure or anything like that. And then you can kind of scale up. So this was the experience that I had. And although I've had this desire for many years to kind of have this lighter weight C# development alternative, it really struck me after working with Node for like 2 years and then coming back. And at the same time, I also work on this team right now called the Azure Mobile Services team that we're going to talk about later. And we started to throw around the idea of like, what if we had a C# experience for authoring services? And would that be a full-blown C# project? Or maybe it would be interesting to have kind of a analogous experience to JavaScript, which would be just a lightweight C# scripting experience. So for all these reasons, I started to kind of experiment on this and think about, hey, could we get the same kind of ecosystem that we have, say, with Node for C#? And just to kind of drive home what that ecosystem looks like, I'm just going to do a simple Node sample for you. So yes, I am on a Mac. So I'm just going to make a folder called Hello Node, and I'll go into that folder. And so I said that Node has a REPL. So I can just type node by itself, and then I can do things like console.log hello. And that will execute immediately. Or I could say var a equals, and then I could write out a. The reason why that undefined is happening is irrelevant, but in Node it's because of the fact that the log function is not actually returning anything. It's just writing out the standard out. So this is a kind of lightweight thing. I can start to tinker completely in Node now with any kind of libraries that are available. For example, if I want to work with the file system, I can say var fs equals require fs. And I now have an fs object that I can work with the file system directly. So it's a really nice kind of tinkering experience. But I can go further than that. Like I can write a web server. So I'll just use my favorite editor these days, which is Sublime Text. And I'm going to write a server.js in Node if you've never seen it. It's pretty interesting. So I'm just going to say var http equals require HTTP. And then I'm going to say http.createServer. And that takes a function with a request and a response. And then I'm going to write out to the response, hello from Node. This is not a Node talk, but I just want to drive home the experience that I was going through that drove me to the point that it drove me to. So now I'm going to listen, and I'm going to listen on port 3000. Let's see if I did that right. Function, da, 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 da. Yes, that looks right. So where did I put that folder? Let's see. There it is. Hello node. Let's save that wrong. Let's just save this one more time. Save as server.js. Yes. OK. So let me get rid of that sh file, because that shouldn't be there. Move. So now I have a web server. So I should be able to open up my browser and go to localhost 3000. Hello from Node. Yay. Well, we're not here for Node, so I don't know. Probably don't want to clap too hard. But now let's say I want to start doing HTTP requests. Now Node has some built-in HTTP libraries, but there's some really nice libraries out there like the request library. And the request library makes a lot of very common scenarios for talking to an HTTP server easy. So what do I do in Node? Well, I have this thing called npm, which is the Node package manager. And there's this huge library of about 40,000 modules that I can tap into in my app. And the install experience is real easy. So right from this folder, I can say npm install request. That will go out to the internet, to the npm registry, and it will pull down the request module and lay it out into my local folder. As soon as it's there, I can actually start to work with it. I can even work with it from the REPL, which I'll show you in a minute, assuming that my internet connection is working, which it looks like it is. OK. Take a few seconds. Come on. Yeah, this internet's slow. OK, so it's now done. And if I look in my local directory, it has installed for me a Node modules folder that it's put the request module in that has all the code that's related to request and all of its dependencies. So now what I could do is go back into that nice REPL, and I can say var request equals require request. And I now have that request module. It's that easy, and I can start to interact with it and use it. So it's great for just like learning. I can tinker with it, but I have the same experience in my script. If I go back to my script that I was doing, I can just as easily now say, OK, well, now I want to bring in the request module. And I can go from there. So you see the flow there. And what's not, there's a few salient things that popped out to me when I looked at this flow. So let's forget about the fact that it says C#. But you can see here that I have no requirement for an IDE. I have no requirement for a project, no requirement for classes, no designer files, no DLLs, no compiling. That's what I'm getting with Node. Well, can I get the same kind of thing for C#? That's what Scriptcs is really about. So we've just seen the Node developer experience where you have this Node core, and we have NPM, which gives us all the modules. So reiterating, that's the Node experience. What about C#? Well, C# actually does have a package manager. And it's really been flourishing. How many people here have used NuGet? So you know about it. So everything nowadays, including stuff coming out of Microsoft, is actually being published as NuGet packages. And that's great. It makes it really easy to just pull stuff in. And similar to Node, those packages don't have to get installed into a global directory. They can be installed specific for your application. And when I start to work with NuGet, I really stop thinking about DLLs. I think about packages. What packages does my particular app need? And I know that all the dependencies will all get taken care of because that is what package managers do. So great. So it meant that we do have part of the problem solved because we now have this package manager. But what about the C# authoring experience? What about allowing me to be able to use Sublime Text, which is also available on Windows or Emacs or whatever text editor you can think of, and allowing me to be able to do that for C# code? Well, it turns out that there is something new called Roslyn. And a lot of people don't understand what Roslyn is about. Some of them work at Microsoft. But the Roslyn is a very cool technology that brings the ability for Visual Studio to offer kind of like what ReSharper and DevExpress and all these different products offer, where it can analyze code and allow you to do different types of gestures and refactorings and other stuff. But at the heart of it, it is a compiler as a service. It is a DLL that you can basically, or a library that you can basically say, here's some C# code, and it will create for you a DLL. It can create that DLL in memory, or you can actually write that DLL to disk. Now, one of the things that Roslyn did, though, going further, is it said, you know, why do we have to require you to have a class? Why can't I just write some loose code? Why can't I just write console.writeLine and not need a main or anything like that? And if you go back to the Node experience, another thing that I think is salient is I didn't go through a build step. I just said node and the script, and it ran, and it went and did what it had to do. So the Roslyn team was trying to really like enable the same kind of thing for C#, that, hey, you could just write some arbitrary loose script, and you can intermingle with that classes and other kinds of things. So that's the Roslyn CTP. And one of the huge things they did, which really addresses one of my pain points, is they shipped it as a NuGet package. And they don't require you to have Visual Studio to use it. Now, that is awesome. Because imagine me standing up here and saying, I'm going to offer you an experience, whether you believe it or not, that doesn't require you to use Visual Studio, but you must install Visual Studio to be able to get that experience. That wouldn't be probably ideal. So fortunately, the Roslyn guys have shipped NuGet packages that you can just use within any application that wants to be able to compile C# and into memory or onto a DLL. You can add references. You can do all the stuff that you would expect with C#. There's a couple of differences. One, today, in the public CTP, it doesn't support dynamic, and it doesn't support async await. Both of those are point-in-time things. They're coming very soon. The other thing is there are no namespaces when you use script. So Roslyn, as a compiler, will compile just general C# files. But now that they've gone into this world of offering this ability to do loose script, the way that translates behind the scenes, just to give you a way to think about it, is it actually generates a wrapper class and a function where that loose code goes. It's all compiler magic behind the scenes that you don't see. So the result of that is any classes that you write in this script model, they get embedded into this inner class. Well, there's no namespaces within inner classes. So that's why there's no namespaces. But you can reference DLLs that have namespaces. So it really is nice because it brings this bridge of, hey, I can write things in a light way in like a script model, but I can also use all of my existing stuff. In particular, this will be true once the async await functionality and the dynamic functionality is in there. Because today, if anything returns dynamic, you're not going to be able to work with it from within your Roslyn bits. But what I found was missing was the connecting of the dots, so the two. So I had Roslyn, which was a library that could allow me to compile some stuff. And Roslyn also has a utility called RCSI, which allows me to run a command line tool, which given a script will run it. It'll do very similar to kind of like what Node does. But one of the big missing pieces I felt was the fact that it had no notion of packages. It allows me to basically use this syntax called #R, where I can point to a DLL. So if I can get all those DLLs into my folder, then I can basically use RCSI to do that. But what you really want, when you look at like something like Node, is ideally, hey, I just install some packages, and they work. And there was a bunch of other things. One of the other things that Roslyn doesn't support today in the public CTP is the ability to include different files. Everything has to be a single file. Well, when you start to get into more sophisticated scripts, you want to kind of span them out. So if we go back to that kind of like Node experience and NPM, that's where Scriptcs comes in. Scriptcs is trying to get you the last mile from what Roslyn brings to the table to a kind of end-to-end experience for developing outside of Visual Studio. And we will be spending the rest of our time to see how it does that. So these are the key things I want you to remember. You don't need an IDE. You will not see me using an IDE except one time, because I will show you something cool we can do with an IDE. So it's not opposed to an IDE, but it doesn't require an IDE. And that's also interesting for the possibility of having like mono support. Now Roslyn does not support mono, but Scriptcs, because it's a layer on top, could basically have an engine under the hood that wasn't Roslyn, like the mono.cs compiler, which also supports the ability to take loose scripts or loose C# and compile it. More about that later. So there's no project, minimum install. So minimum install, assuming you have the .NET framework, which most machines have today. So I wouldn't say that that's minimalist, but based on the fact that we can assume that most machines have the framework or the runtime, then Scriptcs only adds very little on top of that. And then it brings the same model of Node where everything else is a package. You can seamlessly work with packages, and it's really brings a convention-based model where you just drop those in and they work, and we're going to see all that now. So let's jump in and let's see the bare basics. So the way that you get Scriptcs, the easiest way to do it is using Chocolatey. Chocolatey is a really cool installer that can go and install different types of apps on your machine from the command line. So if you install Chocolatey, there's a single command that you have to do, cinst, C-I-N-S-T, space Scriptcs, and it will install Scriptcs for you. If you're going to try and follow along with me, I would ask that you use version 0.6.0 because our latest version, there are some bugs that we need to fix, and it never should have made it to Chocolatey, but it did. So the way you would do that is you would just go first to the Chocolatey homepage. And it will give you this command that you open up into a shell, and you run that, and it will basically install Chocolatey on your machine. It's a single command to do that, so it's real easy. And then you would do cinst scriptcs-version 0.6.0, which would install version 0.6.0 so you don't get all the bugs. All right, so let's say hello to Scriptcs. So Scriptcs is a command line tool, and if I just run scriptcs-help, you'll see that it has a bunch of different commands, and we're going to go through some of them. And So let's start off with a base, very simple script. Excuse me. OK, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a start.csx. This is just a convention. You can do whatever you want. Let me close everything. No. OK, so I'm just going to write console.writeLine hello from Scriptcs. So what I did is I wrote a very simple command, and then I did that wrote to the console, and then I basically just outputted a message. And that worked, and all I had to do was run scriptcs and the name of the script, and it did it for me. Very similar to kind of the Node model or the Ruby model or PHP model. Now, we can go further than that. So, obviously it wouldn't be useful if you could just do things like this. So I can do things like define a class. Or just let's go with, so you notice here that I didn't define any outer class. I didn't define any main method. I just wrote this loose code. So I could do a function, for example. So I'm going to have a function here called greet. And let's say that it accepts a message. And we'll put that in, and then we'll say, hey, go output the message. And order doesn't matter. So I've defined this function. Because of the way it does the procedural code, the order doesn't matter. So I can just say greet hello from Scriptcs. And that should work. OK, so I took a function. I took that code, loose, moved it into a function, but it's still loose. It's not surrounded by any kind of class or anything like that. It worked fine. But I could get a class. So I could say public class greeter. Now, does anyone notice anything interesting about the text that I'm writing here? Anything stand out?
Syntax highlighting.
Syntax highlighting, yes. So there actually is a Sublime Text plugin for Scriptcs that will give you the syntax highlighting. It understands kind of the loose C# syntax. And if you use Sublime Text Package Manager, you can get that. But again, you don't have to be using Sublime Text. You could even do this technically in Visual Studio if you wanted to. OK, so I've got this class now. So now what I want to do is say var greeter equals to new greeter. And then I can say greeter dot greet hello from Scriptcs, and that should still continue to work. OK, now what happens if there's an error? So let's say I called this greaser. What will happen? It's going to give you the same error that you would have gotten in Visual Studio. In this case, what it's saying is, hey, I can't find the namespace of greeter. So, and when you look at this experience, you say, oh, but in Visual Studio, I get all this nice stuff. Again, the idea here is giving you a place where you can operate outside of VS, but it's still going to give you the information you would expect to see. And it's still allowing you to do strong typing and all the other things that you often lose when you go to some of these other dynamic languages. It's still C#. It's not a dynamic language. All right. So now you can also do usings. And I mentioned how Roslyn has this #R syntax. So I could do something like this and say using system.data. And what the ~r syntax does is if you don't put DLL, it assumes that it is pulling something from the global assembly cache. And I'm going to show you a really cool usage of that in a minute. So let's run this again. Still saying greaser, which it's telling me. Thank you, sir. So we know that that actually worked, because if this namespace was not there, like DAT3, I would get an error. There you go. So I'm going to show you one other thing, and then stop for a second so we can think about what we're seeing here. So what if I wanted to allow passing arguments, like a command line tool? In Node or in Ruby, Ruby gems, it's very common to use script or to use the language to create little simple command line tools. And we've done that in .NET with console apps. But now we're in script. Can I get to a useful place where I can pass args in? We actually have a way to do that. We have a collection called Scriptcs args. Or is it script args? Maybe script args. Let me see. I think it's Scriptcs args, but let's see. So I could do something like this, if it's not broken. Let's see. And then what I'm going to do, the way that we specify custom arguments is we have a command line syntax for that. So I can say dash dash, and then I'll say hello. Let's see if it works. Yeah, this may be broken. Let me just see if it's script args. I think it may be script args, not Scriptcs args. It's licensed. I just have not. I can show you over here that I have a Sublime Text license, and this is about the 51st time that I have forgotten to basically register the Windows version, but the Mac version is registered, and I've paid my license. All right, moving on, because that's not that interesting. Okay, so you can pass arbitrary custom arguments, and then you can now have scripts that are like little console utilities that do things. Now, you've got the full power of the .NET framework. So that script, I mean, this could be something like, OK, how many people here have worked with Git? Git has a tool that basically goes and, for example, makes lots of HTTP calls for working with source control and repos and pushing and things like that. You could imagine, if one wanted to, they could basically write a script that similarly goes off and makes HTTP calls working with different systems. You've got the full power of the .NET framework available to you. All right. So I want you to think about that, because one of the things we've seen with Scriptcs, and this was not my intention, is a ton of people are looking at this and saying, wow, I can use this for automation. And there are people that are using this in production for automation, like for processing data, doing tasks and jobs and things like that. And they're saying, why do I need a full-blown project with a DLL when I can just write these very simple scripts and I can test them out and modify them, and life is easy? Because if you take this particular script here that has only a couple of lines of code, if I turn that into a console app, suddenly the amount of files exponentially increases. I think you have something like 50 files minimum or more for even the simplest project when you look at your OBJ and your bin and all this other stuff. So it's just very, very easy. Now, one of the things I showed before, with Node, I was saying how, hey, you can modularize your code, and you can do this require thing and pull in modules. What happens if my scripts start to become kind of unwieldy? Or I want to have reuse. Like maybe I want to reuse this greeter class, which was defined in a script, across different types of scripts. So what we allow you to do, and this is part of the Roslyn specification, though the Roslyn CTP doesn't support it yet, is there's an include, and it's done with a directive called #load. And so the way that works is I can come here and create a new file. And I'm going to go and copy this greeter class in. And I'm going to call it greeter.csx. And now I'm going to put up here a #load greeter.csx. Now that is recursive. So each of those scripts can have other scripts that they pull in. And if multiple scripts refer to the same, we'll make sure that we reconcile all of that and make sure that it only gets actually embedded one time, so they all point to the same functions or the same classes, etc. So that gives you kind of the very basics of working with Scriptcs from the file perspective. But one of the things I showed with Node, what was that first thing I showed when I first went into Node? The REPL. So we have a REPL. So to get the REPL, you just run Scriptcs by itself. And now I can do the same thing. I can say console.writeLine, hello. But I can actually work with variables and save them, like var a equals hello. Oh, that will fail because I don't have a semi. So there we go. And then I can say console.writeLine a. And it even supports multi-line. So if I wanted to, I could define a class here, like foo, that has a method called bar, because everything is foo and bar. And I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to leave it like this. But you see that it didn't actually give me the prompt until I finished it out. So Scriptcs REPL realized that this was a multi-line construct. So now I can say var foo equals to new foo, and I can say foo.bar. Now I can also load from the REPL. So I can say #load greeter.csx, and then I can say var greeter equals to new greeter, and then I can say greeter.greet hello from the REPL. Sorry.
I'm the only guy getting excited here, so I keep cheering for it all.
Anyone have any questions so far? Is this making sense?
No.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Package management. Is that next?
That is coming, but I want to just, we're gonna crawl. It's actually not exactly next. But any questions on this so far? Okay. So because of the fact that I can reference, yes?
So what you just did there, so you're like that, So what you just did there, you're using the REPL to script dynamically.
Yep.
Can you save that out to a file? So you're doing stuff and you go, oh yeah, cool, I just got that working.
Yeah, so what you're saying is I was playing around in the question I think is, I'm in the REPL, I'm playing around with stuff, can I dump that to a file? Because I want to save it. We don't have that yet, we will. That is something that's on the roadmap. And it's an open source project, so we'll accept your pull request. Yes?
That was my question. Who is we?
Great question. So Scriptcs, I started it, and immediately when I saw the reaction that the community had when I was describing that I was going to put this thing out there, and people were like really excited, like I wish I had that. Oh, that would be awesome. Blah 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 blah. So I put it out there. I spent half a day. I spent 6 hours writing the first version, and it only took me 15 minutes of playing with Roslyn to figure out how the Roslyn syntax worked. And I was like, whoa, that is actually really cool. So immediately I partnered up with Phillip Weicherson, who's a hopefully soon one of our MVPs, but he's been very involved on the ASP.NET side, and he had actually done a blog post on using Roslyn for Web API, and Justin Rusbatch, who wrote Compilify.net, that actually used Roslyn. And we got together on the weekend, and the rest is history. So we basically now have a project that has over 100 forks. It has about 30 active committers. tons of pull requests. So it's a very active and growing project. We're still the main dictators, and we have 2 more people that we've added to the core team, a guy named Damian Schenkelman, who's done some amazing work on Scriptcs, and also Christian Helang. So let me make it clear, this is not a Microsoft project. I work at Microsoft, and I started this thing on the side, but this is basically a community-run thing. I was just the instigator. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. And everything's available on NuGet, by the way, and Chocolatey. So all of our core functionality is available as NuGet packages, and we are on GitHub. If you go to github.com/scriptcs, you'll see that we have an organization where we've got a bunch of different projects. The main one is Scriptcs itself. And you can look and see like the active contributors, number of commits. It's only about 5 months old, the project. And it's got over 600 watchers, so it's getting a lot of interest. So yeah, that's the project. And we would welcome anybody here who wants to contribute. I mean, this is ripe for anyone to contribute to. We love contributors. We wouldn't be where we are without the contributors. Okay, so moving on. So this is all cool, kind of console-y stuff, but what else can you do? And we're not getting to the packages yet. So let's look at a different example. So where is it? Scriptcs-samples. So we have a Scriptcs samples repo. A bunch of them are broken right now, and we need to fix them. The one I'm going to show you right now is not. But there's people who've done things like using RavenDB, Fluent Automation. I'll try to run that one. That one is actually really cool. And there's things with Web API, with Nancy, with RavenDB. People are just getting really excited about exploring what can they do with script. So like with Nancy, that's saying I'm writing a Nancy application completely just in script. And there's a bunch of work that people have done to make those experiences simpler in script, which we'll take a look at. But I want to show you this one just to give you kind of an idea of how far you can go. So Jason's going to really like this one. So this is a Wpf calculator. Now, obviously, it doesn't have anything pretty about it, but it works. And it's using ViewModel. And there's no project. There's no designer files. By the fact that it's using ViewModel, that allows us to just bind up, take some XAML, which it's loading loosely. And actually, there are APIs in WPF for loading loose XAML. And then we just bind it to a ViewModel. All of that's been created in script. But remember, the script only exists until the compilation happens. There is a compilation. Ultimately, it just ends up like a DLL like any other with a slightly different layout within. Okay, so I have this calculator. I just crashed. I just did something that probably, who knows what I did. But let's take a look at what the app looks like, just so you can see how this is working. So because of the fact that I can reference things from the GAC, this is referencing all the WPF namespaces that I need from the GAC. Now, let me make a disclaimer. We did this to show what was possible. It was not like we were actually recommending that you would do this calculator this way. But on the other hand, it does show that you could do some simple harnesses. If you wanted to do some simple UI stuff and you're comfortable with XAML, you could do it. So here you see I'm using those pound loads, and I'm loading up a bunch of different things, which we'll take a look at. So here I have my app, and I'm creating a calculator view model. I've got an application, which is what I would expect in a standard WPF app. I've created my calculator view, and then I've set my data context to my view model, and I'm now showing. Now, it's not all as pretty as it sounds because of this. So what we found when we started to work with frameworks in script, and this will be a lead-in to what I'm going to show you next, is that some frameworks require things like launching something in a separate thread. With WPF, you have to launch the UI in the proper thread. So we ended up starting to write some ugly code. Like, for example, here is code to load the loose XAML. That was something that we didn't find There was no simple function that we could just call, so we had to write this kind of code. That gets in the way if I want to use WPF, unless I have this common code and I have to worry about kind of carrying it around. So that was a little bit of a pain point of this process, that sometimes you have to write this extra glue code to make things work well in kind of the scripting environment. And then here you can see that I've got to create a thread and set the apartment state in order to be able to have that calculator pop up properly. But it's doable. And then if we jump in, this is just a standard view model. Nothing special. This is just standard XAML. It's not script XAML, it's just regular XAML. The difference is that we're compiling it using the XAML compiler. We're taking that loose script and we're turning it into a real control that we can then bind to. Now, the next thing people hit into when they look at this is they say, well, what about debugging? Like, is there any way that I could actually debug this? Because I'm OK with working in script, but if my application starts to get pretty sophisticated, it'd be nice to not be back to the world of ASP.NET, ASP 1.0, where I'm just doing like, response.write, it happened, or it's about to happen, and it happened. So it turns out that there actually is a debugging path. It's not super pretty now. We have a wiki that shows you how to do it, but I want to show you that it is actually possible. And we'll use this calculator one as an example. So the way that you do it is in Visual Studio, a lot of you may not know this, but you can actually open up an exe as a project. Did you know that?
No.
Yeah, I'm going to show you.
Only in old versions of Visual Studio when something would crash and say, do you want to debug this, hit OK, and crazy stuff comes up.
Right. So I'm going to do File, Open Project, and then I'm going to point to my scriptcs.exe. Now, I already have an SLN, which I'm going to switch over to. But when I click on this, you see that it actually gave me a project. Now, I already had an SLN there, but this is the kind of project it would give you. It wouldn't have had any of these solution files. I have to add them, and I have to go through and do a little bit of setup here, like telling it what file I want to run. I pass a debug parameter, which then we create proper symbols and things like that so that it's going to be debuggable. And I have to give it a working directory. We're going to make all this much better than it is today. But what I wanted to show you is once you do that and you set this up, it is totally possible to debug. So for example, I'll put a breakpoint here on this display string when it's getting set. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to run it. Yeah, that's OK. So you can see that I actually have a breakpoint. And I can even hover over things. And it's actually quite nice. I can have watches. So there is a path if you want to use Visual Studio. If you're using scripts, but you want to get to a place where you need to step through stuff, you can do it. Some people say they don't need to. But what this shows is that there is a path forward which could offer a much richer experience in the future. Today, it's a bunch of crap you have to do. Excuse that word. But we're going to make it better. All right. So what did we learn? You can write code in the REPL or standalone. You don't need a class. You can write procedural code. You can include other scripts with #load. You can reference assemblies with #r. By the way, you don't only have the ability to reference GACT assemblies. You can reference other assemblies. You can drop an assembly in and use #r and just give the name. But you won't have to, you'll see shortly. And you can access script arguments with script args. The rest is just plain old C# with a few limitations, like there's no namespaces. There won't be namespaces ever, so that's not a point-in-time limitation. That is probably never going to change because of the fact that inner classes cannot be, you can't have a namespace within a class. But everything else, as far as like dynamic and async await, will be there. Task is there today, so you can still do async type things. You just don't get the syntactic sugar that the compiler gives you. All right. So I started off and I gave you all this stuff about Node and NPM, and I said, hey, we've got NuGet and we've got packages, and Roslyn doesn't bridge the two, but Scriptcs does. So how does it do that? So Scriptcs actually has a command called install. And when you use install, it will actually use the NuGet APIs. We use NuGet actually has it's kind of very meta, but NuGet has its own NuGet packages, which NuGet itself is written in. Go figure that one out. So we reference that, and we basically will go and call out to NuGet for you and get packages. And one of the reasons we did that, because originally we thought about just using NuGet.exe. We found some limitations, and one of them was that with NuGet, if you just give it a, it has this feature called package restore. And you can give it a file, a packages.config, but it expects that all of the dependencies from top to bottom are there. Whereas with Node, when I do npm install and I give it a module, it will go and get all the children associated with it. So Scriptcs install will do that for you. It will actually go and you can just give it the top level packages, and it will get all the packages. But what this then opens up is the ability to access all the stuff that NuGet has to offer. So let's just see a very quick demo of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say scriptcs-install. And the scenario here is I was talking about how I could talk to another HTTP server. Well, one such server, which actually is not HTTP, it's using TCP/IP, is MongoDB. MongoDB is a NoSQL database. I'm assuming a bunch of you guys have heard of it. And MongoDB has a NuGet package. OK, so that would mean that I could go into the REPL and work with MongoDB. Kind of like I would have like Query Analyzer. Get a nice little thing that I just open up and I start like sending, working with this NoSQL database really easily using the API, but I don't have to compile. I don't need a project, yada, yada, yada. I could also create scripts to populate data into MongoDB. That's a very easy thing. Why do I need a project to do it? What I really want is just a file that I could run that then takes all that data and puts it up there. And I can do that with this as well. So I'm going to run scriptcs-install MongoDB, which is going to go out to NuGet, and it's going to pull down MongoDB. Slowly on this connection, but not on your connection.
Where will they put it?
That's a good question. Where will it put it? It will put it in a packages folder. So in the same way as Node puts things into a Node modules folder, it will put it into a packages folder. So if I look in here, oops, I keep doing that, sorry. They're two different commands. You can see that the MongoDB package got pulled down. We also did something else, though. And this is where we departed a little bit from the way npm does things. We assumed that if you had no packages.config, you probably want one. So we automatically went, and if there was no packages.config, we created the packages.config for you. If there was a packages.config and you were just adding something new, incrementally, it will go and update the packages.config for you. Why is that interesting? Because now I can take this, put it into a repo like GitHub, and then I can basically not include the modules, but I just include the packages.config. So then what happens when somebody pulls this down from GitHub? How will they get MongoDB? Well, we have another command for doing that. So, well, it's the same command. You just don't pass anything to it. So I'm going to remove my packages folder. And now I'm just going to do scriptcs-install with nothing. And this is also taken very similar to like what npm does for Node. You do npm install, it looks for a package.json. Scriptcs install looks for a packages.config, and it will go and pull down those packages. So you have an easy way to kind of share these apps with other people without having to copy all of that stuff across for the packages. Now, here's where it gets interesting, though. So now I want to work with MongoDB. So let's use that REPL example that I said. So I'm going to go into scriptcs. Now, here's where I believe we've done a really nice job. So I don't have to put $R, I don't have to put $load. The very fact that that module or that package was installed, it will automatically get discovered and loaded. So I can now go using MongoDB, for example, .bson if I want to work with the bson API. And then I can say var doc equals to new bson document. And now I have a bson document. So I'm just working locally, but I could do other things like start to connect to a MongoDB instance. So the nice thing here is it's removing a lot of monotony. that wouldn't necessarily hit me if I was in VS because I have all that tooling working for me. So here, you don't have all that tooling because you're just in a little command line interface. So we leverage convention to make a lot of things easier for you. So any package that's there, the principle is if the package is there, you want to use it, we're automatically going to load it for you. Make sense? OK. So, so that's packages. So you don't have to install NuGet.exe. One of the things why that's nice, too, is because of the fact that it's just easier. Like you install Scriptcs and you're done. You don't have to now go and do another thing to get NuGet. We saw that it will install via packages.config. It will install all the dependencies locally where I can easily just delete them. The packages are automatically loaded. I just add a using statement and I can access them. So we saw one example of Scriptcs in action as far as the calculator, like a more end-to-end kind of scenario. And we saw MongoDB. What else can you do? So we have a ton of different samples, but I'm going to just show you one. And that's going to bring us to another interesting place of conversation. So, sorry. That's not what I wanted. OK. It's just a refresh problem. Hold on. I need to reboot my VM. Let just be a second. Come on. Let's try again. Hello, world. So I'm hitting a web API. This is a web API that is completely hosted within Script. Now, this is using the web API packages. So if I look at my packages.config, you can see that it's pulling in Web API self-host. Notice I didn't specify any of the other packages. So this is the thing that scriptcs-install will do for you, because Web API self-host actually depends on a ton of different things. All those things are actually living today, right now in the packages, in the packages folder. But simply by installing Web API self-host, they all got pulled in. That is really what Scriptcs install does. So if we look at this, let's see. Let me add that sample as well. So I'm newing up a HTTP self-host server. You see I've got a bunch of using statements. So although the references were automatically there for the NuGet packages, I still have to put the using statements. Now that kind of hits you, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But it works. And then because of the fact that I'm in self-host, Web API actually has a bunch of stuff you have to do. Like you have to new up a configuration object, and you have to configure routes. And then because of the fact that Scriptcs compiles assemblies into memory, you basically need to set up a custom controller type resolver that can resolve dynamic types, because Web API by default, and it turns out Nancy and a lot of these frameworks are not designed to deal with assemblies that are emitted in memory. They just weren't designed for that. So, but it works. And then I have my controller here. So this leads into the next very interesting topic, which is, and you've seen this already even with the WPF one, that not everything in script land with C# is pretty. Like, take these namespaces here. That's great when I have Visual Studio generating for me starter code. But if I'm just writing from the editor or from the REPL, I don't necessarily know what needs to be there. Or maybe I just do a typo, and if I do a typo, I'm going to get an error. So it's kind of a little bit annoying that I have to do that boilerplate code. But I don't think about it when I'm in VS, because VS takes care of it for me. And then there's kind of this setup code that I have to do. Like I have to know to new up a HTTP self-host server. Again, I have to know like what's the name. If the name is wrong, it's not going to work right. I have to know the parameters. Not to mention this custom controller resolver and then all this other boilerplate that I have to do. So I could just save this stuff and just reuse it every time I want to. And I would write that code once, or I could get that off of GitHub or whatever. But it's kind of ugly. So this is where we've introduced this concept called script packs. Now, in Node, what you saw was I require a module. That module actually gives me an object in JavaScript. And from that object, I get a bunch of functions just hanging off of it that lead me to the next place that I need to go. So I don't need to know about namespaces. I don't need to new up objects. All I do is require, and those I have to know what, of course, what methods to call, but you know, it's much simpler. Now, there's no using statements because that's just the way JavaScript works. Like it's just a difference. But it hurts you, and we saw this, and we were like, that's not good. Like, we want this to be much better. Because when I write that web API code, all I really care about in all of this is this. This is all I want to write. I don't want to write all that other stuff. And you could imagine if I could do that, hey, it would be really easy to just play with web API for the first time. I could just copy a file in and just go. So what script packs do is they are designed to make APIs more consumable from script. They wrap existing frameworks and provide a nicer interaction. So one of the things they can do is inject using statements. So instead of me having to write all those using statements, they can do it for me. And they can also give you like a module type model where it gives you an object that you can just use to get to the next step. So what do I mean? Well, if I go to GitHub and I go to Scriptcs-Web Api, you'll see the Web API script pack starter code. That's what it vanishes down to if I'm using the script pack. So all that other boilerplate goes away, and the magic is here. I have this new API that I can call within my scripts, which Scriptcs offers you this is not part of Roslyn, called require of t. And the idea is the script pack is installed as a module, as a package. So you use scriptcs-install. We're going to go through and do it right now. And then once you require that, you will get back an object that then can offer you nice helper functions to just go forward. Now, it is still having to configure routes and all that other stuff, but I'm not having to do it. The script pack is doing it. The script pack is setting up Web API and getting me to the place where I can just use it. So all I have to do is have, this is much less code that I have to write. And then I get to really spend more of my time thinking about the code that I actually want to write. And these things are NuGet packages, and anybody can create them. So let's see a demo of the Web API script pack. So that's the code that I just showed you in the browser. It's already there in this file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do scriptcs-install scriptcs.webapi. And that's going to go out to NuGet, and it's going to get the Web API script pack. Which will be taking a few seconds. Will take more than a few seconds. It's working, it's just slow. There we go. So it installed all these packages for me. Now, how did it know to pull all those packages in? Because of the fact that the script pack is its own package, it specifies all the dependencies it needs. It pulls in all of the Web API stuff that I need. So now I can just go Scriptcs. Now, if you try this at home, make sure you're running as admin because you can't open ports. This is not a script thing. This is just a .NET thing that you won't be able to listen on local ports without running as admin. So I'm just going to do scriptcs.test.csx, and it's listening. And now if I do localhost 8080/test, it says hello world. So there's a ton of script packs out there today. Well, I wouldn't say a ton, but there's a growing number of script packs out there today. So if you go to our Scriptcs repo, we actually have a wiki. And on the wiki, you will find a bunch of different articles, and one of them about how to author a script pack. And you'll find this list of script packs. So like there's a bunch for Azure. There's some pretty cool ones that let you attach to a running .NET 4 process on the machine and poke on it and debug it and kind of like Son of Strike kind of things if you guys are familiar with that low-level stuff. There's a Nancy script pack. There's a .NET. There's a Net script pack which just makes it easy to create TCP servers and clients. And there's an NUnit runner. There's just a bunch of stuff that's happening, and it's there's a WPF one. So if you use the WPF script pack, all that boilerplate code that you saw for setting up the calculator example vanishes, where you just actually require WPF. So where is it? Right here. And then it gives you this function, run in STA. So it's just making it simpler. And the thing that should pop too is notice there's no using statements. And that's really nice, because those are things that could be typed wrong when you're in a REPL or you're in a text editor. All righty. So just reiterating, these are kind of the main things that script packs are doing, and they're open, and you can create your own. Before we get into the next section, which will be our final, and then we'll move to mobile services, which I know we're probably running a little bit over, but we started late as well and took a break and such. Is there any questions so far on what you've seen?
So where do you see this going? Like, what kind of crazy stuff do you imagine people are going to do? Do you imagine, like, oh, my app needs this because I'm doing web pages, or I'm going to spawn off some script within a real like line of business application versus a utility or something like that? Have you seen or talked or thought of that?
That's a great question. Anybody heard of Octopus Deploy? Yeah. So Octopus Deploy, which is close to home here, Paul actually added support for Scriptcs, so that when my deployments are happening, I can actually execute code, whereas before all he had was support for PowerShell. And he's added, so, and there's a lot of people that actually have been looking and saying, wherever I was using PowerShell before, now this was not our goal, but would at least augment with the ability to say, hey, you could use Scriptcs. Why would I want to do that? Well, because if I'm a C# developer, and I can get it done with C#, that may be easier for me than having to learn a completely different way of doing it. Now, I don't ever imagine IT admins are going to be doing that, so I don't think there's a question of like, is this going to replace PowerShell, though for some devs it might, and they've said it will. So that's one example. Another place that I think, and this will lead into the hosting, is interesting, is extensibility. So imagine that calculator. Now, this would never happen, but imagine that calculator was a shipped app, and I say, hey, you can write your own operators. And you can write those operators as script. Often those operators are really simple. They're just a couple of lines of logic. Why do I need a full-blown project, DLL, whatever? It will actually make it more approachable to, you know, maybe even less kind of, even tinkerers might feel comfortable just writing a script if you show them the syntax. So I think there's a lot of interesting places to go as far as extending apps using script. I do see customers today that are now using it for their own automation, a little bit different than what Octopus Deploy is doing. Octopus Deploy is a product that you buy, and it is offering now, in addition to PowerShell scripts. There's a guy that I know, Kyle, I think Roach is his last name. He works for this big trucking company. They're using Scriptcs for processing data. They used to have all these VS projects that they were using for manipulating data that comes in from all different kinds of feeds. And they found that every time they changed that, it was a big headache. They have to rebuild it. And they were like, oh, we can use Scriptcs for that. So I think there's a bunch of people that will look at it for automation of kind of simple things, or even running in production systems for business rules would be another great place. Now, imagine I'm on a server. I'm on a full-blown web server, but I want to make it easy for people to write business rules in a simple editor. Up comes a text editor, you write your rule. That could just be some C# code that is executing, thanks to the hosting layer that we have, which I'll get into in a minute. So does that answer your question? I'll show you one other thing. This is a thing called Fluent Automation. Has anybody heard of Fluent Automation? So Fluent Automation, yes, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
If I'm using this for automation of a line of business application, the word security just sort of kind of flying up and hits me in the face. How am I going to manage the security implications of that?
So you could host, the question is, how am I going to manage the security implications? And what I assume you're saying is, hey, somebody could write some malicious code that does something. Well, first off, it depends on where that code is executing. For example, if that code is executing within a web app, that's running in an isolated app pool. But yeah, sure, somebody could write some code that could do something. There's a couple of different ways that I could think about addressing that. One is possibly using something like fxcop to parse files that customers are giving you with scripts to look for patterns, like are they using commands that they shouldn't be using. We don't do any kind of isolation guarantee. You can do isolation. You could spin up your own app domain and use our hosting layer to run in that isolated sandbox, but you're going to do that. We won't stop you from doing that, and we have a library that you could easily leverage within an app domain. But we don't offer any such guarantee. So that is really going to be a decision that you're going to have to take, whether you decide to isolate in an app domain and then set up policies using code access security, which is horrendous, but yes, you can use it. Or you decide to do some type of file parsing, fxcop-ish type thing that will parse the scripts and look for common patterns and say, oh, you're not allowed to use anything in the system.regex namespace or something like that. But yeah, there's no magic answer for that one.
In other words, either trust the user or it's hard.
Yes, and in actuality, that is a common pattern today. App domain isolation is a very hard problem to solve, yet the world goes on. People continue to build extensible apps where people can extend it and where, yeah, they could call a command that shuts something down. If they did, that person's going to get, kicked out of the service or whatever the case may be. But yeah, there's some, what I would say is it is possible. I don't want to say it's not possible because the .NET framework will allow you to spin up separate app domains and load DLLs. So you could totally say, I'm spinning up an app domain, I'm configuring its security context, and then I'm going to run the scripts from within that domain. And it may be that there will be some work that will get done to make that easier in Scriptcs, like if somebody like you was to jump in and say, this is really important to me, we'll talk about it, and maybe that's something. But we don't have anything today, so I don't want to allude that we do. We don't.
Another problem with security is dumb users. I write a piece of code, and I even do this myself, with endless loops in it.
Yeah.
Is there a way that it tracks?
So what you're saying is like a stack exception or something like that?
Even worse, still something that's not going to get a stack overflow, something that's just in an endless loop and it's never going to exit.
Yeah, it's, again, so one thing I will say is Roslyn does have the ability to analyze syntax trees, and you can write code that analyzes that syntax tree. So that actually, that is a possible option, is to actually, and we could look at in Scriptcs offering you the ability to take the syntax tree and run some custom code against that, because then what the syntax tree is it will convert that code into an object graph that you could then look at and say, oh, is this in this namespace, etc. But no, I don't think there's any magic solution for that problem.
Thank you.
Sure. So we're kind of over, but I wanted to just show one last thing. So we actually do have a hosting layer. And so what the hosting layer is designed to allow you to do is kind of what we just talked about, which is, hey, I want to use Scriptcs within a different environment for processing scripts. And one of the interesting places that we've been looking at that is actually ASP.NET. So imagine I could write controllers as just functions, and I didn't even need classes. Where I could just say, well, like, why do I need the class? All I really need is to write a function. So it is possible to basically host scripts within ASP.NET, and I'm going to show you a sample that does what I just described. So I will close this, which we're not using anymore, which is the debugger. So first, I'm just going to run this. Ignore that message. So here I've done API/test, and it says hello from test controller, and it's giving me a message. And then I can also go and do tables/contact. Table, let's see, there's a table. Probably need to fix this. What would that be? It should be working. No, let me see what I'm doing here wrong. Table. Oh no, that should be working. Table.
Gives you API?
No, it should be. There we go. Okay, so I got back a JSON object. So imagine like that test controller was as simple as something like this. I just write a function that basically is called get that returns a string. We will turn that into a controller for you. Now, where does the name come from? The name comes from the file. I called the file test.csx, so that will turn into a test controller. Now, one of the things you notice there is it's got this helpers thing. Where did that helpers thing come from? Well, I've got a folder here called shared. And in shared, I've just dropped a function. So this is some convention-based mojo here. But the idea is anything that I put in shared will then get turned into its own classes that I can then leverage from within my controllers. So in this case, you can see that I've newed up helpers, because this was called helpers.csx. I got a class called helpers. Don't worry about the squigglies. And then I was able to call on that helpers class this getTypeInfo function that I wrote. Now, this is a full-fledged controller at runtime, so I can actually access things like the request. It's an API controller. I can do whatever I want. Another example is the idea of an entity kind of controller, something that's bound to a database. So here I have a controller that's returning this thing called a contact. Now here I've just dummied it up, but imagine that this was something that was going against a database somewhere. Well, where is that contact coming from? Now this one's kind of interesting. We'll see how you react to it. So that's a model. So in the same way as I can write loose functions and turn them into a controller, here I'm just writing loose properties, and based on the name, I'm turning that into a class. And the class name is contact, so that will be a model called contact, which I can then leverage within my contact controller. So what this is really exploring is saying, can we take this kind of minimalistic type experience and pour it onto some of our existing frameworks? Could we offer a path like this, say, for something like Web API? And if I go back to what I was talking to you about mobile services, which this is not a commitment, but from an experimentation standpoint, which you'll see, is giving like a JavaScript-y-like experience for C#. So this is just removing a whole bunch of plumbing. Again, you see no using statements. I don't have to write a class. From a hosting angle, though, the key thing is that I've been able to actually host these scripts within a full-blown ASP.NET application. And so if I look down in my app start here, you'll see that I'm using a thing called a script assembly builder. This is just a prototype. And I'm passing it my bin, my web bin folder. And then it's assuming that in the web bin, it's going to find this scripts folder with this service folder underneath. And it's going to pick up all of those scripts. And I'm able to plug in a bunch of rules, like a table strategy. And the table strategy says, hey, if the file that's being processed is in the folder called table, then let me turn this thing into a table. If the file that's being processed is under API, let me turn it into an API. But again, the meta level is that I was able to take scripts and add them into a different type of environment, which was a non-script environment. So one question I'll ask for you just to get your feedback, when you see something like this kind of syntax, what goes through your head? Like, imagine you could step through it and debug it and do all the kinds of things you would expect.
What I really want is dynamic types. I mean, so because you know what you're doing is effectively building types dynamically, but you know what they are. So I mean, you can't do dynamic. That's not good to me.
Okay. Well, dynamic is coming. So dynamic will be there. I think there is value to having strong types, like adding functions and validation rules and other kinds of things. So we want to support that. I agree with you that it would be nice to have dynamic types. One of the challenges is there's not a great story from an entity framework perspective for dealing with dynamic types. So if you think about EF being in the mix, which we did, there's not a great story there for being able to go typeless with EF yet. Maybe that will change in the future, and maybe work like this can inform. But what I was really asking more is like this kind of lightweight syntax, does that scare you? Do you feel like, oh, that's just like too much different than C#, or do you feel like I could actually work with something like this?
That's the way MVC should have been done.
So I'll take it that you like it. Anybody else? How do you feel? Anyone scared by it?
I like the idea.
From the point of view of the controller setup, yep, the properties, like just loose properties to find a model, that's the one that's going to turn people off.
Okay. Why do you think it will?
Just because it looks so foreign. Like, it looks completely foreign. Something like this still looks
Does that look like a controller? That's just a
no, but
that
that still looks like a code file, whereas the other thing just looks like, yeah, it just looks really loose.
Yeah, I agree. It looks pretty interesting.
I didn't say it was necessarily bad. I said it looked very foreign, and that's what scares people.
Let me point out too that it's not mutually exclusive. With this model, I could still write the full controller. This is again all about offering an alternative path. Even with script, I could write public class foo controller, and it would work. But this is just offering me a path where I don't have to do that. All right, so we're way over, or fairly over. I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about was just quickly, just like what some of the things that are coming on the roadmap. We've added a feature to Scriptcs recently called modules. For those of you that are familiar with IOC containers like AutoFac, the concept of a module for Scriptcs is a way to extend Scriptcs itself. So let me give you an example. One of the things people have wanted is to be able to say that in my script I could put #gist, or just put like gist ID equals blah, and it would go and get that gist for me from GitHub. So that is extending Scriptcs. We probably would not put that in the box for a bunch of reasons, but with the module model, you could basically install from NuGet a module that would enable that kind of functionality. Modules open up a ton of capability because you can override all the services of Scriptcs itself. Like in the same way I'm showing here how I'm doing some rewriting to inject a class wrapper, you could do other kinds of things. You could introduce aliases to the language. You could say if I do CW, that's equivalent to console.writeline. So there's some interesting things there, and we've kind of been back and forth on whether we like it or don't like it, but I think you're going to see a bunch of kind of people going further. And the downside of that is it breaks an original goal we had, which was that you could easily take your script and upgrade it to a full-fledged C# application. But you know, it's opt-in. If you choose to go down that path and use those kinds of aliases and other tricks, then yeah, you're not going to be able to upgrade. But on the other hand, there's people that are saying, I have no goal to upgrade, and I just want to make this experience as easy as possible. The other big item that has been on the cards for a while and which modules enables is the possibility of mono support. So we are working on a mono engine. Scriptcs architecture, it has an engine which by default is Roslyn, but it doesn't have to be. And so we want to have the ability for you to go on like a Linux box and write scripts. There's some other really interesting things going on. Phillip recently demoed a web REPL using SignalR that you could like imagine deploying to an Azure website, and you go into a browser and you get like a REPL that you're typing stuff and it's shuttling that code over SignalR to the server, which is executing it and returning the response. So I think you're going to see a lot of interesting things coming in the future. And there are teams at Microsoft that are looking at Scriptcs, both from a, hey, these patterns are interesting. What does that mean for us in terms of just how we think about stuff, whether we use Scriptcs or not? And hey, maybe we can actually use this in some places, because Microsoft is no longer the open source averse company it used to be, fortunately. So that's it for the Scriptcs demo. You can, or for the Scriptcs talk. You can find out more at github.com/scriptcs/scriptcs, and I hope to see you guys sending pull requests. And thank you guys very, very much for your patience. And we will keep the mobile services talk a little shorter. That's it.
Did you get all that? We'll take the SSW TV quiz and test your knowledge now.